Should schools be able to give breathalyzer tests to students? If school staffers believe a student has been drinking, how about then? Well, that very question and scenario has been buzzing in the Rockland County town of Nyack for weeks now. School board has been debating a change to its rules that would require students to submit to testing if they are suspected of drinking before or during class, school events, even the prom. The bill was tabled by a board last night. Now, administrators, they call this a safety measure and say it's not in response to any change in student behavior or any trends. Superintendent explains what would happen if a student tests positive for booze.
If a student does in fact come up positive on the breathalyzer, they are turned over to the parent or guardian. In addition, part of the policy calls for students to have some counseling with our student assistant counselor, and yes, there is a consequence.
And students who refuse to take a breathalyzer test came as a student who tested positive. Now, some parents expressed outrage over the proposal at the board meeting last night, as did some students that we also caught up with.
We haven't had a big problem with people drinking in school. I don't think there's one incident.
It's a violation of our rights.
It's just not a good idea. Like, they have no faith in us.
I'm not a criminal. I've done nothing wrong.
Okay. It's unclear what the legalities are on this proposal. Go back to 2014, a school in Minnesota added a requirement that all students take a breath test before going to prom. ACLU objected, and the school later dropped that requirement. In this particular case, last night, the board decided to table the issue as well. Okay, but nonetheless, Amy, we always hear or remember the expression in loco parenti. I'll give the same scenario. Kid, teacher, administrator, whatever, sees a kid staggering in the hallway or going out to the parking lot. Let's say they don't stop the student. Student gets in the car, plows into another student. Who at this table doesn't think that there's a lawsuit by the victim and the victim's family against the school for not, in effect, policing and managing the situation? It seems to me the school was offering to take a proactive step here, but obviously with all the pressures, they stepped down, and I can understand why, but where's that limit between invasion of privacy and at the same time assuming the responsibilities people are imposing on the school when they're on school grounds?
I think it's more than invasion of privacy. I think it is school administrators stepping into the role of law enforcement. I mean, they're going to have to make judgment calls on probable cause. They're going to be gathering evidence, because that's what this would be, evidence that could be used later on in a prosecution. Then they're opening themselves up to liability for civil rights lawsuits, because it's going to be voluntary whether you take the breathalyzer test or not. And even if a student agrees to take it, later on they're going to say, hey, no, I refused. I was coerced by the teacher. So it's a bad idea. What do? They call the parents immediately, call the cops immediately if you suspect something. But for teachers to be making those judgment calls, I think is just a really bad idea.
Okay, but do the same scenario, Mel. Kid gets in the car after the school. I said, you know what, I'm not liking the way you're walking. I'm not liking the way, the odor on your breath, you're staggering or whatever. Kid gets in an accident. Please, the school is going to be held responsible as if they were the parent, because they were managing the kid while the kid was on school grounds.
Well, the school acts in the shoes of the parent in loco parentis. Now, you have to anticipate that they're going to do so reasonably. And that means that if the child is staggering, if the child is unsteady on his or her feet, suppose you give the breath test. If the kid passes the breath test, do you let him get in the car anyway?
Yeah.
No, you don't, because you still say that kid is staggering, that kid's unsteady on his or her feet. Or they could be having a seizure, they could be having a neurological, any kind of illness. So you still take reasonable steps. I don't think anyone in the world would have a successful lawsuit for saying you didn't allow my child to drive because he or she was stumbling to the car. But you don't, once you start to go into the breath test, now it's a taking. Now you're starting to actually violate, their
but you know
freedom from unlawful search and seizure.
They go in kids' lockers.
They do.
It's not like a minor in a school has unfettered rights, and I mean,
the locker is not the same as your body.
That's right. They have diminished rights. They have diminished rights, and by entering into the school program, they are voluntarily saying, "I consent to a search of a locker which is on your premises, which you're allowing me to use in order to house my personal items, so I don't have to carry around all of these books all day, or my gym clothes, and so on and so forth." You're consenting to that. There's a big difference There's a very big difference than allowing them to take bodily fluids from you or a breathalyzer on perhaps what's a whim of the teacher. In this bill,
But the intent of this, Jimmy, though, was the security and safety of the kid and the people in the surrounding area.
But
okay?
Amy's got a good point. It's not as though that without the ability to breathalyze a student, you have no remedy. If you see a child staggering, if you see something going on, you bring the child into the principal's office or into the dean's office and you say, listen, I don't like the way you look or the way you're acting. I'm concerned. Please stay here. You can't move. And you call parents and you don't let that child leave until you've alerted the parents as to what's going on. You know, a child is staggering and you let that child leave school, you don't know if that child's getting into a car. You can't be held liable for what a child does an hour or two afterward when you don't know whether the kid's getting into a car, getting on a bicycle or anything else. You have remedies. You stop the child right there and you call parents. Or if you suspect narcotics activity, you call the police.
Final thing on this,
And
I
the
think
school,
I
by the
agree
way,
with all
avoids
three of you
liability
guys.
the other way,
I
Rich,
understand, but
they
it
avoid-
does seem that we put these schools between a rock and a hard place, where we expect them to police and have a safe environment, a clean environment, or an environment that isn't going to influence other kids and all the rest. And then when they attempt to police it, we say, who are you? Their parents? But yet, in a certain aspect, you're holding them to parental responsibility if something, God forbid, happens on campus.
I don't think so, because we have metal detectors in schools. So, you know, I just think there's a limit on how far you can go.
Let's assume that the child appears to be intoxicated and they're sitting in a classroom. They're not getting ready to get into a car. Well, what should the school do? At that point, the school should say, you know, maybe you should go to the nurse. Make sure that that kid's okay. Maybe that child goes home. Maybe they need to go to the doctor. Maybe you need to call an ambulance. Maybe they've taken NyQuil and NyQuil's making them do that.
Say that exact situation. You're going to need to go to the nurse. You're going to need to go to D105, remember, for detention, right? The point is the kid goes, no.
Well,
Now you're going to let the kid walk out of school?
no, you're not going to let the child walk out of
What are
school.
you going to do? You're going to physically restrain him?
Well, you're not going to do like the police officer
Oh,
did.
we-
who
we-
picked up the desk.
Not so easy, Dale. Not so easy. What are you going to do?
You're going to have trained professionals who work at the school. What they're going to do is they're going to, and presumably you're talking about a kid that's not belligerent. If the child's a threat to the safety of other kids, that's a different story. It's very different than him or her saying, I'm not going to get up and go to the nurse.
So then you're going to let him use force to detain the kid if he's being
I
belligerent.
don't think you need to necessarily use force at that
Do you
point
understand
either.
how difficult it is
It
to
is
be a
a
school
difficult-
administrator now?
But they've been
what's the
doing it.
difference
They've
with
been
the
doing it
breathalyzer test? They
for.
say
They've been
no.
doing it for decades and decades and decades.
that's why
They know
everybody's
how to
not cut
deal
out
with
to be a
it.
teacher.
Listen, the school doesn't want that headache. They don't want that. You're talking about them getting sued by somebody if the kid gets in a car. You know how many
Do
lawsuits
you
they're
really
going to
think
have?
Nyack was looking for more headaches? They were trying. I think their heart was in the right place here.
But
now,
what's wrong?
Then my
What's
taxes
wrong
are
with
gonna go
calling
up.
the? What's
There we
what's
go.
wrong with calling the? What's wrong with calling? That's what they did when you were in detention and I was sitting next to
They
you.
didn't call the
called
cops,
our
they
parents. Well, they called
And
our
then you wish that
parents.
they called the
Yeah,
police.
yeah, exactly. All right. Coming up next, there's a new FX series started last night. Maybe some of you saw it. It's about the O.J. Simpson trial. It's putting the case back in the headlines. We're going to look at how 20 years later, it's still impacting the way that we look at the judicial system. Stay with us.